The legislature of Louisiana puts the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms all over the state, triggering the left.
Help! Help! I'm being repressed!
And causing them to pull out some of their weakest and most ridiculous arguments.
This law is a prime example of Christian nationalism, the Christian nationalism that's on march across this entire country.
Among them, in their arsenal, is that this violates the separation of church and state, which is obviously in the Constitution. Because this is one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of society today, we're going to talk about it on Indie Thinker. Welcome to the show. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. My name is Reed Huberman. Now, you've heard by now, most likely because of the belly aching of the left, that the Louisiana legislature, duly elected by the people of that state, I should remind you, have voted to put a poster-sized copy of the Ten Commandments in every single classroom. Now, in response to this, organizations like the ACLU have threatened to sue. Now, where were these defenders of freedom when an elderly woman was being sentenced to 10 years in prison for singing in an abortion clinic? Where were they when Dr. Ethan Haim was indicted by the Biden DOJ for leaking documents that showed that the Texas Children's Hospital was actually violating state law in performing castrations and other things in minors? Apparently, the civil liberties of these people only matter if you align with left-wing causes. But as always, the most ridiculous and over-the-top reactions have come about this incident from people who like to pull string dolls and rehash the same tired and wrong arguments every single time something like this comes up.
Separation of church and state.
So there it is, separation of church and state. Obviously, it's in the Constitution. Everyone knows this. And if you're a really, if you're not a fascist, then you don't want 10 commandments, being beheld by children. Could you think of anything more damaging to them?
Day one of being a girl, and I have already cried 3 times.
Before we get to that argument, let me just first try to appeal to you reasonably, if I can. I know there are a lot of people who have emotional knee-jerk reactions when it comes to Christianity for some reason. Maybe you got butthurt in church one time. But you really don't want to live in a secular society. You don't want to live in a world where the government starts removing religious imagery from the public square. By the way, if you want to see what that looks like, all you have to do is go to the bloodiest century in human history, the 20th century, look at Maoist China and Stalin's Russia, and you can kind of see what it looks like when the federal government militates against religion. It's not pretty. Besides that, you don't really want to live in a society where we don't believe in objective moral values. And whether you like this argument or not, it is undeniably true that in order to have objective moral values, you must have standards outside of yourself that didn't come from you, or you just have your own personal opinion. You do you if we don't have a transcendent set of moral values. Well, already, now we're talking religious language, because transcendent moral values transcend you, and transcendent is a property of God, so they must come from God. Now, I am not arguing that in order to be a good person, you must be a Christian or to do that which is good. I am simply arguing that the property of goodness doesn't belong to any human being, period. That if there is anything good in you, it didn't come from you. And you wouldn't even know how to define good if we didn't have an objective standard of what good actually looks like. And of course, the greatest standard for that goodness is none other than God, and is embodied in 10 commandments that are utterly irrefutable to people if you're not willing to get all emotional about this.
Oh, I see. So you don't want to see a close-up picture of my anus because you hate gay men.
No. Because what is the real problem of 10 commandments being hung in a classroom in the first place? Now, there were some really morally benighted, intelligent people online who argued, you people on the right say you don't want pride flags in classroom because they indoctrinate children into sexual ideology, but now you're trying to indoctrinate children because of these 10 commandments. Well, you're totally wrong on one hand and then slightly right on the other hand. Yes, we do not want children to be indoctrinated by a sexual orientation, which is nothing like the 10 Commandments. So the equation there is totally off. There is no equivalence between a pride flag and the 10 Commandments. What exactly is wrong with the messages communicated by the 10 Commandments such that we should have a big problem exposing children to this as though it were dangerous? I mean, do you really want to argue that we can't have harmful content like obey your parents, before children? Is that really something that is harmful to kids? Are you so anti-religious that your face will melt off like in Indiana Jones if we open up the Ark of the Covenant and reveal the Ten Commandments for everyone to see? No, obviously, this is an irrational response, and it triggers people on the left because they honestly don't want to be confronted with their own sinfulness, I feel. Most importantly, there is this sense in which people are kind of ignorant as to what our Constitution actually says. And this is where separation of church comes into play. So separation of church and state and its relation to the First Amendment is one of the most misunderstood concepts in modern life. If we can discover that, then we may be prevented from misunderstanding a lot of other things as well. So I think it's beneficial to talk about the separation of church and state, where it actually comes from, and actually what the First Amendment actually says. Because the mainstream idea has clearly not been influenced by philosophy, education, history, logic, or reason, but rather, your understanding of separation of church and state and the First Amendment has largely been engineered by the Supreme Court. You may even oddly think that that's good. I personally don't, but you shouldn't think it's good. And it shouldn't keep us from asking how the Supreme Court has influenced our understanding about the Constitution and a myriad of other issues. Because once you do that, you can start understanding whether or not what they did was right, and if you actually truly do agree with that concept, and if it's good for our society as a whole. And I can do this quickly via a pop quiz. Are the words separation of church and state found in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, or any of our founding documents whatsoever? And if you answered yes to any of that, then you can rest assured that you have been influenced by a Supreme Court decision that ultimately made that argument. See, the modern interpretation of separation of church and state and how it relates to the First Amendment was something that was unheard of before 1947 and a Supreme Court decision called Everson v. Board of Education. And oddly, this case took place right before the civil rights movement did, and it was oddly about busing. And it also included bigotry, just of a religious kind. But in this case, Everson was arguing that Catholic kids that went to private school that were being placed on the same buses as public school kids, well, this was a violation of separation of church and state, and the federal government needs to stop this intrusion of religion onto the public square. We can't have these kids on the same buses with us, even though Everson was paying taxes, and the parents of these Catholic kids were paying taxes, only these parents of the Catholic kids weren't getting anything back for their taxes in terms of public school education because they were sending their kids to private school and paying that tuition, but still paying taxes just like Everson. But it is unjust to let these kids on the bus, and this needs to stop. And the Supreme Court agreed with Everson, and as a result, in their decision, for the first time, the federal government now took over a state's right to decide what it could do whenever religion was involved. Prior to this time, the First Amendment had always been interpreted as a protection of the states from the federal government, but this Supreme Court decision totally inverted that. Now, to support this claim even further, I want to give you the historical context before Everson v. Board of Education. I want to show you that the First Amendment has nothing to do, certainly with Catholic kids getting bused to their schools, but most importantly has nothing to do with Christian ideas or religious ideas as a whole being introduced into the public square. First and foremost, I would remind you that the historical context of the Constitution is pilgrims and founding fathers who were fleeing religious persecution, largely, from the Church of England. And they originally came to the United States to develop a more freer, perfect land. Not freedom from religion, but the freedom of religion, the freedom to practice their religion without the federal government cramming their ideas down their throat. This is where you get founding fathers like John Adams coming along and saying this Constitution is written for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. As you can see, our founding fathers were perfectly religious, the vast majority of them, and they were not interested in making sure that the federal government crammed down their secularism on religious people. And of course, the original quotation of the separation of church and state, at least as far as the American experiment is concerned, was from Thomas Jefferson when he was writing to the Danbury Baptist. And there he says that there would be a wall of separation between the church and the state. Now, quick question here. Put your thinking cap on. Shouldn't take much. Do you believe that Thomas Jefferson is assuring the Danbury Baptist that their religion would not be represented and that we are instituting a secular government that will have no vestige of religion in it whatsoever? Do you think that's really what the Danbury Baptist needed some assurance of? Or do you think that Jefferson is arguing, rather, that they would have the freedom to practice their religion unhindered by the federal government? See, people pursuing freedom of religion, not freedom from religion, were the ones who came to the United States. While we're on the subject of history, you should know that the Bible is the most quoted book in our founding documents. No other book even comes close. And you can do a database search on former case law, and you can find over 1,000 references to the Ten Commandments, because our American jurisprudence is based upon the Old Testament. So, point of fact, those who were arguing that you're taking history out of schools and then want to take the Ten Commandments out of school are actually being hypocrites, because the Ten Commandments is a historical fact and a historical reality for the American experiment. But maybe even more substantively, all you have to do is look at the wording of the First Amendment to see that separation of church and state is not present there. When the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, to make this argument best, I send you to Alan Keyes, who tells us that by the very wording of the First Amendment, you can see that what the Constitution is actually doing is handcuffing the federal government from being able to adjudicate anything that might infringe upon the religious liberty of people, especially people in particular states who want to make their own laws. So here's Alan Keyes.
The Constitution of the United States says nothing about separation of church and state.
Absolutely not.
The First Amendment, which they always cite, the Establishment Clause, actually says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. When you think it through, the real implication of that phrase also, though, is not to prohibit religious establishment. Some people argue that. No. What it says is Congress shall make no law respecting, not prohibiting, but respecting an establishment of religion. What does that mean? Well, respecting means concerning, on the subject of, with regard to, dealing with. So it means Congress shall make no law that has anything whatsoever to do with religious establishment. Well, my friends, if it can't address the issue at all, that means it can't say yes to religious establishment, and it also can't say no. It can't interfere with anything that's done on this subject. So you'll ask me, okay, Alan, who can address it? Well, the Constitution's also clear about this. In the 10th Amendment, it says that any power that's not given to the United States government by the Constitution, or explicitly prohibited by the U.S. Constitution to the states, is reserved to the states respectively and to the people. That means that the power that was explicitly withheld from the federal government, the power to deal with the issue of religious establishment, and remember, that means all these issues that have to do with the relation between church and state, how you acknowledge God, whether you acknowledge God, what can be done, prayer in schools, display of monuments, all the whole range of issues that have to do with that subject, right? The federal government has no lawful authority to address those issues at all whatsoever.
And what Alan Keyes is saying there is 100% true. Essentially what he's saying is that if the federal government were to press down upon Louisiana and say, you can't put 10 commandments in classrooms, they would actually be violating the First Amendment. And this was the heart of what the First Amendment was all about. The federal government is not there to restrict religion, nor are they there to establish a religion. Now, simply what that means is that the government cannot form a federal church that then, therefore, they force everybody to go to. Everybody must be a convert to this church, and everybody must adhere to the teachings of this church and be in attendance to this church, or you're getting thrown into prison. So you can't establish a federal church like that. So here's the real question, and this is the one that deserves to be asked. Is it establishing a religion to put the 10 Commandments in classrooms? Well, what religion would that be exactly, since Muslims and Jews and Christians hold to the authority of the Old Testament and that the Ten Commandments are an authoritative document by God? So is it establishing one or all three of those religions exactly? And are we forcing kids to believe that the God of the Old Testament is the only one true God, which would be beneficial to them? But are we really doing that by simply putting a poster in a classroom? Of course it isn't. That's why the Department of Justice isn't going after Louisiana. Trust me, they would if they could. That's why they're sending their little dogs, the ACLU and the SPLC, upon the state of Louisiana to sue them, rather than the federal government coming in and saying, hey, this is a violation of federal law. Now, I get it. This won't keep people from arguing that the language of the First Amendment, it implies that we're not supposed to have any expression of religion in public school system. Not at all. It may not say it explicitly, Reed, but it doesn't say it, but it does say it implicitly. No, it isn't. It's not historical, that's not rational, and it just isn't true. There is not a federal religion being established just because the state of Louisiana wants to put the Ten Commandments in classrooms. The Ten Commandments being in classrooms is not a violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution, nor is it a violation of another's free speech or anything like that. And in fact, the opposite is true, that if the federal government came in and tried to keep Louisiana from doing that, they would actually be violating the First Amendment. Now, I know you believe somehow in the deep cockles of your heart that John Lennon was right. We need a world without religion, a world without borders, and then everything would be so much better than that. But let's just say, for those who have studied history, at least a little, we've tried that and it doesn't go great. The reason I bring all of this up is not that we deeply misunderstand the historical context and the reality of what separation of church and state is actually about, and that it's about the freedom of religion, not freedom from religion in the public square, which I've said 3 times now, just to reiterate the point. But ultimately, I'm also concerned with the way that we think and the things that influence our thinking. If we're truly going to think for ourselves, then we need to be cognizant of the ways that we think and who is actually dictating that to us. I think largely we are being dictated by cultural institutions rather than by free thinking and reason. And for that reason, I think it's important for us to connect our understanding of separation of church and state to Everson v. Board of Education. If it weren't for that case, we probably would think wildly different. Now, I know there's other cases like it that have also gone in to influence our thinking, but it's important that we know that there isn't some grassroots, organic way in which the Overton window is shifting or the way in which our mind is working is changing and that we're evolving. That's not what the progressive movement is really doing, although they will argue that that's what they're doing. We've just evolved beyond gender roles and we're better than that now. But that isn't what is happening. What's largely happening is that institutions are influencing the way that we think and who we are. And that might be okay if they're leading us down a pathway that leads to greater truth and greater reason, but in fact, they're leading us down pathways that lead to ultimate harm. Jamie Bambrick argued this on his show a while back, and he essentially kind of flipped the old paradigm that many of us have heard before, that culture is upstream from politics. In other words, we have to change culture and the way people think in order to truly shift the way politics is happening in policy. And oddly, I think the reverse is actually way more true, is that ultimately there are political organizations who are influencing and shaping the way that we think. The Overton window is being shaped by culture, but perhaps way more by the political than we think. And I would go a little bit further and just say institutions are engineering the way that we think, that they are largely creating the society that they want to see. And the reason that's problematic is just simply this, that the institutions have a financial motive almost always behind everything that they're doing. Their motive isn't truth. So when a Christian comes into the public square, what is their motive? Now, of course, it can be perverted, and some of them might say financial gain is their motive. But is it really a opportunistic thing to put 10 commandments in classrooms? Or is it a way to communicate to children that morals matter and that God created you to be a moral being? And where is the financial motive structure there? Isn't that a value that is of inestimable worth, especially for young minds? Even if you don't believe the Bible as I do, or that Jesus Christ is Lord as I do, maybe it's important for you to push aside your blind hatred of Christianity in order to see how it is good for society. People like Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray, and many others have done that and written glowingly about the West and Christianity, and if you separate the two, the destruction that will come. I would argue and urge you to think about the fact that some of these actors and some of these institutions in secular society today want a secular society because they know a secular society can easily be manipulated and destroyed. But for those who put their hope in something bigger than government and institutions, but put their hope in God, they are way less easy to be manipulated by these earthly powers. And if that's true, I think that Christianity is a great good, not just for Louisiana classrooms, but for you and for me. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for watching. If this show was beneficial to you, don't forget to comment down below, like, share, and subscribe, and to check out our sponsors in the description of this podcast. But most importantly, go with God.